And so we've been talking about this idea of being an exile. And an exile is something I think that we don't often think about as American Christians, because we've often kind of thought to ourselves that America is a Christian country, and so we live in a Christian country, and we're Christians, and therefore the rhythms of government and civic life and all the things that we go through is essentially Christian. And so we're here in America, and we're Christians, and America's a Christian country, and so we're just kind of all part of that. And then we bump into actual immigrants and exiles, and we don't really relate to them very well. We kind of look at people that are not fitting into the rhythms of our culture, and we kind of go, what's wrong with them, right? And then I think the reason we do that is because we've kind of lost the idea that we're actually exiles. We've become so comfortable in the culture, so comfortable with the way things work around us, that we actually have forgotten that we're a people without a country. And then we go to the Bible, and every major character of the Bible is someone who was kind of in exile. I mean, even Jesus, though he's born in Bethlehem, and he is a Jew, yet early in his life, he's driven to Egypt, and he lives in exile for much of his young adulthood, growing up as an exile. You look all over the New Testament, every believer is in exile. Every believer seems to be pushed away from their hometown. And so this idea of exile is a really important aspect of Christian identity, and I think it allows us to recover our mission. How do we serve the city for the good of the city unless we're exiles? Because if we're so bought into the culture, then what's going to end up happening is we're either going to assimilate to the culture or we're going to fight the culture. And we're not supposed to do either of those things. We're actually supposed to engage the city for the good of the city. And so that's what we've been talking about in this series. This is the last installment of the series. We're not preaching through the whole book of Daniel. We're ending here in chapter 6 because the rest of the book gets very apocalyptic, very prophetic. And what happens is Daniel has a bunch of dreams, over and over and over again, and they're pretty difficult to understand. Not that we wouldn't preach through them someday, but, it takes a lot of work. And so we're going to leave that for another day. We're going to end in the easy part of Daniel in chapter 6. And Phil was here last week, and he was right when he said the first 6 chapters is kind of like the court. It's Nebuchadnezzar, it's Belshazzar, and now it's Darius. And Daniel has served all 3 kings incredibly faithfully. And we're going to look at that again. Now, here's what we're trying to kind of lean into as exiles. And there's a quote I've been kind of showing you every week, and I want to show you again because I want to show you how this plays out in today's passage. This is a quote by John Piper. I love it. Here's what it says. It says, "The greatness of Christian exiles is not success, but service. Whether we win or lose, we witness to the way of truth, beauty, and joy. We don't own culture or rule it, we serve it." And I always like to say, because I think it's incredibly important to understand, and it doesn't own us or rule us. When something just feels right, because it's what the culture is doing, you've been owned by culture. If it just seems like that's the right way to do it, that's the way our kids should grow up, that's the way our house should be ordered, that's the way our role should work in marriage, if we just kind of go, well, that's the way it should be because that's the way everyone's doing it, we've been owned by culture. And we might be surprised how much of the rhythms we live in are not Christian, they're just culture. We've got to be really paying attention to that. Because if we're really going to take this gospel to every nation, language, and tongue, we've got to take a gospel of Jesus, not the culture of Chuck or the culture of America, and push that, right? So he says, hey, we're not ruled by the culture. We serve it with broken-hearted joy and long-suffering mercy for the good of mankind and the glory of Jesus Christ. That's what Christian exiles do. We exist to live and serve for the good of the city and for the glory of God. And we've been seeing week after week how Daniel and the 3 guys that run with him, how they have served the good of the king, how they have served the good of the city, and yet they have also stood in some resistance. And we're going to see that again this morning. You know, it's interesting when you come to this chapter. I've titled this sermon, The Lion Whisperer. Because if you grew up in church, you know this passage. Like, this is not a strange passage to you. You learned it in Sunday school. You know about Daniel in the lion's den, right? You know how, King Nebuchadnezzar, or not Nebuchadnezzar, Darius was like, he put Daniel in charge of everything, and Daniel was this great leader. He called him a president, actually, and he had several officials underneath him, and he was like the top official under Darius, and the other officials, they were like, hey, we don't like this Daniel guy. He's too powerful. And so they get jealous of Daniel, and so they hatch a plan, right? And the plan is to get Daniel in trouble, and they know the only way to get Daniel in trouble is to put him in conflict with the law of God, because they know Daniel won't violate the law of God. And so that's how this story plays out. But there's some interesting things in here that as exiles, as people who exist to serve the good of the city for the glory of God, what is Daniel doing to serve the good of the city for the glory of God? It's interesting. When you come to chapter 6, verse 1, you look at Darius. Here's the king. And it pleased him in verse 1 to set the kingdom, over the kingdom, 120 satraps. Now, these are like officials, governors, and they're to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel is one, to whom the satraps should give an account. So Daniel's over him. He's one of 3 presidents under the king, and he's got all these officials that report to him, right? Now, Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. And when the president and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, with no error or fault to be found in him. Now, here's an exile. Here's a Jew working for a pagan king, the 3rd pagan king he's had to work for. So it's not like God was like, hey, Daniel, I'm sending you to Babylon, and you're going to have to work for this one really bad king, but that's okay. Get through that, and it'll all be roses after that. No, he serves one really bad king who's a horrible king, but he serves him really faithfully. He speaks truth to him. He walks with him. He challenges him to be godly. He challenges him to stop oppressing the poor, and yet he serves him faithfully. And that kingdom comes down, and another king comes, and he's worse than Nebuchadnezzar. He's more evil than Nebuchadnezzar, and yet he serves that king faithfully. And then that king comes out, and Darius, who's now ruling the known world as the Persian king, he's in charge. And you can read the history books. This is not a good guy. This is not like, a real cool, loving the world kind of person. This guy is raping the world for power, trying to control the world and to bring it all under his power. He's not a great guy, and yet Daniel serves him faithfully, and what it says, and with an excellent spirit. Church, you don't have to like your job to have an excellent spirit and to serve faithfully. Now, I know, and this affects millennials a lot, but us millennials, I call myself, I'm like the older millennial. I'm like the eldest millennial you can find, okay? I think millennials started in 1981. That's me. So I'm like the grandpa millennial, okay? Us millennials don't like to work hard at our jobs if we don't think the job is valuable. We don't like to work hard at the jobs. This is just stuff you can study about millennials. They don't like to work hard at their job if it seems like the job is menial. They don't like to work hard at their job if it seems like it doesn't have really deep, moral significance. And you'll find this among millennials. It's kind of like, well, that's just one of those jobs. You got to work up the ladder, or that's one of those jobs, and I don't really agree with the boss. And it seems like the excuse millennials use, we don't have to work that hard. We don't have to have an excellent spirit. We don't have to be faithful at that job. And we do that all the time. We look at the people we work for. We look at the way they do things, and we might have legitimate cause to say they're ungodly, they're unbiblical, they're ruthless, they're mean, I don't like them. And therefore, I don't have to have an excellent spirit. I don't have to do my job with excellence, and I don't have to be faithful. And yet, Daniel is in that place, and you got to remember, he's listening to the prophet Jeremiah. See, Jeremiah is prophesying at the same time, and Jeremiah tells all of the royalty that was taken to Babylon, listen, Daniel, listen, Jewish royalty, when you're in Babylon, you need to faithfully serve the city. So Daniel knows the command of God is to be in a pagan place and yet serve with excellence and to be faithful at what he does. Church, do we do that? I mean, do we do that in the city? Do we faithfully serve people who do not have a God thought? Are not thinking in terms of justice and righteousness? Yet do we serve them with excellence and faithfulness? I think there's a challenge there, because I think oftentimes we can look at our places of employment and look at the city around us, and we can just say, man, it's bad. And I tell you, I got an internal rebellion inside of me when Christians begin to pull away from those workplaces and they celebrate Christian workplaces. I know of even Christian gyms, right, where people don't want to work out with people who don't know Jesus. And so they get gyms that are Christian gyms so that everyone who works at this gym is a Christian, because they don't want to engage faithfully and with excellence around people who don't know Jesus. That has nothing to do with the way the gospel works. The gospel is putting us in these places as exiles and demanding of us that we represent Christ as people of excellence and of faithfulness. And so Daniel is in that place. He's got an excellent spirit within him. He is faithful. There is no complaint against him. There is nothing they can say except to say that he honors the law of his God. He honors the law of his God. And so if we want to get to him, we need to put him in conflict with the law of his God. We need to bring the law of God into a place where if he honors that, he's in conflict with the authorities to be. Now, you may have been in a situation like that, and maybe you haven't. If you've never been in a situation in your workplace and in your culture where your faithfulness to Jesus didn't put you in conflict with the people and the culture and the authorities around you, you may have just adopted the culture around you. That's just real talk. Because I promise you that the culture we're in is not Christian. And people do not act in Christian ways. And so if the law of God has never put you in conflict with the authorities to be around you, you may have just accepted full-heartedly the culture that you're living in. The law of God is always going to put a tension. And the question is, how do we resolve that tension? Are we going to be they used to call it in my day, are we going to be a fighting fundy? We're just going to be a fighter? You guys know what fighting fundy? Fundy is fundamentalist. Oh, yeah, sorry, listen. Yeah. Maybe it's Missouri talk. We're just going to be in the culture war. We're just throwing punches. Boom, boom, boom. They're bad. Those people are bad. I can't believe it. We're gossiping about them all the time. We're just a fighting fundy. Or we're just embracing everything that's going on around us. And Daniel doesn't do either of those things as he navigates this. But there's a plot to get him and to put in conflict with the law of God. So check out how the plot unfolds. These presidents, these satraps, they come by agreement to the king and they say to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, they've agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction with whoever makes a petition to any god or man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions." Man, this king is not so bright. I mean, what happens when people come to you and here's what we need to do. We need to create a law where everyone just thinks you're awesome. And if we say anybody else is awesome, they need to be killed. How about we do that? So if anybody prays, now you got to understand, at this time, there are tons of different religions that have been conquered by King Darius. So you got all these different religions are there. But the difference between Jews and every other religion is every other religion doesn't really care who you pray to. They can actually cross their boxes off. So they can pray to this God or that God. It doesn't really matter. The God of the valley, the God of the mountains, the God who brings the harvest, the God for the sowing. And you pray to all of them because you're hoping for good luck that the gods love you. Jews are a little bit different. Jews can't just put one God on the shelf and pray to the other God so that they get good luck. So Jews are now in conflict with these pagan gods who bring all the other religions underneath them, all the pluralism, bring it all underneath them. It's all fine. You can have your religion. You can have your religion. It's all great. And at different times, you're going to have to be quiet because I'm really the one in power. A Jew says, no, there's one true God. And that's where Christians find ourselves. We are in a very pluralistic world. And the world would love to tell us, hey, listen, you got your God, you got your God, you got your God, but hey, you know what you need to do? You need to keep that in your shelf. You need to keep that back in the corner. You need to be quiet with that. And there's going to be times where you need to bow down to this God of the culture. You need to bow down to this God of the culture, wherever that might be. And as people who follow Jesus, as we engage our city, we're going to be put in conflict when that comes down from those in authority. And so they get the king to sign this petition. And the question is, how is Daniel going to disobey? How is he going to disobey the civil authorities? He knows he's supposed to honor them, but how is he going to disobey them? And I want you to see this in verse 9. The king signs the petition. You're not allowed to pray to anybody else but him for 30 days. And if you do, you get thrown to the lions. And then in verse 10, Daniel knew that the decree had been signed, and he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day, and he prayed. And he gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. How does Daniel disobey the civil authorities? He does it in 2 very simple but very powerful ways. He does it peacefully, and he does it publicly. He does it peacefully, and he does it publicly. See, there are a lot of people that want to pull us into the culture wars, and they want to say, hey, you see that bad thing going on in culture? Let's fight it. And so there's all this desire to get people yelling and shouting and attacking and threatening. I mean, I grew up in a background where, and listen, I'm deeply concerned about the unborn. But I grew up in a background where people who were concerned about the unborn thought it might not be that bad idea to assassinate an abortion doctor. Okay, you kind of would hear some of that language. Let's violently oppose the system. Let's violently oppose the injustice. Let's violently oppose the king, the authority. Let's protest, let's yell, let's shout. Let's get on Facebook and put people on blast. Right? Daniel's peaceful. He's peaceful, but he's also public. Because, see, the culture would love for you to say, hey, listen, here's what you could have done, Daniel. I mean, come on, this doesn't make any sense, right? Daniel, listen, for 30 days, why don't you just pray where you're not in front of the window? Do you have to do that, Daniel? Just pray in your heart. Can't you pray in your heart? But because here's the lie that American culture has said to us, is that our faith is primarily personal. Do you know your faith isn't primarily personal? Your and I's faith is not primarily personal. We are never called to Christ by ourselves. Do you know that? Ever. Not in the whole Bible. We're always called to Christ as a family. We're always called to Christ as a people. He is gathering a people to himself. So your faith, your convictions, your beliefs are not primarily personal. And there's nowhere in Scripture you could find it. Everything God calls you to do is both personal and public. God doesn't call a family to himself to sit in this room by ourselves and have a personal connection with God by ourselves. He calls a family together, 1 Peter says, so that when we open our mouths, we tell the world about the excellencies of Jesus. This is the reason why you have the Great Commission at the end of Matthew 28. Jesus gets done with his whole ministry, and he gets everybody together, and he says, I'm about to go, and you have one thing you're supposed to do if you're called my children. And that's to go to every nation, tribe, and tongue to tell them about how God has come to rescue the world through his life, his death, and his resurrection. So when we buy the cultural lie that our faith is primarily personal, and by extension, is best to be kept private, we have given into the culture. Now, Daniel doesn't come out fighting and screaming and wearing Christian t-shirts and blogging and screaming on Facebook, and he's not out there fighting, but he's not private. He's peaceful and he's public. And both of those things kind of push on our culture, doesn't it? Aren't those the things warring at us right now? Let's get you into some kind of fight. Pick a side. Pick a fight. Or keep it private. Keep it quiet. Keep it in the back. And the gospel says, no, I'm going to be public, but I'm also going to be peaceful. That's really strange, isn't it, to the world? That you would be public and bold and courageous about how you're rejecting the law of the culture around you, and yet peaceful and kind and gentle about the way you walk that out. See, that's not what our culture gets from people. So what the culture gets from people is, if you don't like me, therefore I'm not invited to your place. I can't eat at your table. We can't be friends. We can't hang out, because when you disagree with me, you fight me. They don't know what it looks like for people to disagree, to stop and say, I'm not going to give in to the law of the land, and yet I'm peaceful and I'm loving. But I'm also not going to be private, and I'm not going to be silenced. I'm going to be public. And so that's how he addresses this. He's going to be in civic, public, peaceful disobedience to the law of the land. And of course, that gets him thrown into the lion's den. Of course, the king realizes he's been tricked. The king realizes that this is not going to be good, and he's worried he's going to lose his best president. Look at verse 14. He heard these words, and he was much distressed, and he set his mind how to deliver Daniel. Daniel's been seen praying. Daniel's been seen breaking the law. Daniel's been seen peacefully, but publicly saying, I'm not going to give in to the law of the land. And the king says, hey, I want to rescue him. How do I do that? And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then the men came by the agreement to the king, and they said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. You can't change it. And the king commanded, and Daniel was brought, and he was cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. And the stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lord, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. And no diversions were brought to him, and the sleep fled from him. And then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. And the king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have been done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Then the king commanded, and those men who had been maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they and their children and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. And you ask, why? Why does Daniel have to go through this? Why does God put Daniel sovereignly in this place and ask him to go through this? Okay, so yeah, great. God closed the mouth of the lions. Daniel didn't know that was going to happen. I mean, now we look back and we go, oh, man, isn't that awesome? You go down to the lion's den and the lions don't get you. Hey, but can I just be honest with you? Sometimes the lions get you. That's not the point of the story here. Lots of Christians fed to the lions in the first century, just historically. So the point of the story is, hey, be bold for Jesus, be courageous for Jesus. And if you do that, the lions aren't going to get you. I'm just telling you, brothers and sisters, sometimes the lions get you. That's not the point of the story. Daniel's going to tell you what the point of the story is, because this has been the point in every single chapter. Every time the exiles stand for God and engage the king for the good of the city, the king always has one response. And it's like they copy and paste. It's like Daniel writes it down again. There, King Nebuchadnezzar said it. Every time I stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar, and every time he saw that God was the one true God, here's what he wrote. This is the point of being an exile. And the king writes to all the peoples and nations and languages that dwell on the earth. You understand? This is Daniel's life as an exile, is to get whoever's in power to see the one true God. And then to expand that. He says, to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. And I write a decree that in my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Why does Daniel live like an exile? Why do you and I live like an exile? So that the fame of God goes to every nation, tribe, and tongue. That's why we exist. We do not exist primarily for ourselves. And the gospel that God came to us is not primarily for us personally and privately. It is for us, but it's for the nations. And so Daniel is put in a very tough place, asked to do a very tough thing. Why? So that a pagan king sees God and then takes the fame of God to the nations and tongues. Everything the exile does is to promote the fame of God to the nations. That the peoples and nations and languages that dwell on the earth, that they would fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion will be to the end. He delivers and he rescues. So two things. The exile lives like an exile so the fame of God spreads to the nations, but they also live as an exile so that a pagan king can say, hey, God saves. God saves. When we walk out this faithfully and humbly and courageously, people look in and go, that God saves. That God rescues. That God works. And as they see that we serve a God that rescues and saves, the fame of God spreads. And that's why we live as exiles. You know, the worship team can come back up, and I'm almost done here. As Daniel's been walking this out, there's been a couple times in the first 6 chapters that have given us a clue to why Daniel has the courage to live the way he does. The first is that he had a dream in chapter 2 that as God was knocking down kingdoms, that the last kingdom that God would raise up would be a kingdom that would last forever. And that this kingdom would be an eternal kingdom that would bring justice to the land. And then he hears the words of Jeremiah in his head that says, hey, serve the good of the city because there's a future, there's a hope for you. So Daniel does what he does because he has a picture, a radical picture of a future hope. And I want to read this to you as we close this morning. This is the thing that puts steel in our bones to get up every day and say, God, I will honor you. I'm not here to fight the culture. I'm here to serve the culture. I'm not going to be owned by the culture, but I'm going to love the culture. I'm going to engage people in broken spaces, but I'm not going to give in. I'm going to stand as someone who honors you in the middle of the place you've put me to be. Now, how do you do that? Again and again. How do you do it to King Nebuchadnezzar when he says, if you don't bow down to the God, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to throw you in the fire. How do you do it to Darius when he says, if you don't pray to me, I'm going to throw you in the den? Again and again, because it's not going to be one opportunity. It's not going to be a 2-second opportunity. It's going to be over and over and over again where we're called to live out the gospel of Jesus. And how do we do it? He has this view of the future. And so in chapter 7, he gets a dream. And here's the dream. He says, I looked, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. And his clothing was as white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. And his throne was fury flames, and the wheels were burning fires. And a stream of fire issued and came out from him. And thousands served him. And 10,000s stood before him. The Ancient of Days, fire in his hair, thousands before him. And I looked, and because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed. The enemy was destroyed. Justice was served, and its body was destroyed, and it was given over to be burned. In verse 13, and I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the cloud of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man, and he came as the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages would serve him. And his dominion would be an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom shall be one that will not be destroyed. How do you live like an exile again and again and again? How do you stand up with courage again and again and again? You do it with a picture of the future. Where are we going, and who is on his way to bring an ultimate rescue? He's the Ancient of Days. His name is Jesus. And Daniel can live the way he lives because he has the Ancient of Days in front of him. He knows that there is a king coming who makes everything right in the world. And so as he waits for that king, he will serve the good of the city for the glory of God. And that's what we're called to do as exiles. Let's pray.